I struggle with friendship. It's really something I've known for years. I've had people come and try to get into my life, and I've had numerous people actually say, "You're really hard to get to know." And I realize that. In fact, people will try to get in, and there's just like this wall. I can remember when I was a little kid that remember very vividly, even in elementary school, and things got kind of serious. And if people started talking about real sort of stuff, and that wall would go up. Maybe you can relate with that just a bit. Maybe you are that type of person. Maybe you're not that kind of person, and you just don't get people like me. I learned something this last Tuesday evening that I've known for a while, but the reality is I've not always been the best at putting that into practice. Our small group was meeting. In fact, we were getting ready for supper. It was just a little bit before 6:30, and we were doing what we hardly ever do before supper. We were actually sitting around the living room talking. The folks that host our small group are Fred and Monique Culin, and Fred and Monique were sitting in the living room. All of a sudden, I noticed that Monique wasn't there any longer, and then I noticed Fred wasn't there any longer. I got up and poked my head around the corner, and Fred was on the phone and had this frantic look on his face, and he looked at me and said, "I have to call 911. Monique collapsed. And in their bedroom, Monique collapsed because of pain, because of pancreatitis that just came on very, very quickly. So 911 came, other people came to the group, and we didn't really get to have like group. I tell you, I'm not always the most observant guy in the world, but one of the guys in the group, his name is Rick, came to me and said, "Fred shouldn't really be driving." He said, "Why don't you drive Fred into town?" So I hopped in Fred's truck after the ambulance left and drove Fred into town. You know, on the way to the hospital, I realized something. This was not pastor, church member moment. This was real life friendship being lived in real time. And I would love to tell you that we talked spiritual conversations. We did not. Fred and Monique just got back from an anniversary trip to Mexico, and we talked about that. Tara and I are getting ready to celebrate our 25th. We're going on an anniversary trip. We talked about that. We talked about kids. We talked about grandkids. We talked about cars, and we even talked about cigars. It was real friendship. It was real life. You know, when I got home Tuesday night, and I was kind of decompressing a bit, I had that realization that we in our world need to be more open to friendship. I think too many times, though, we kind of put friendship on the back burner and say, I'll get around to it when I have more time. But having more time is never going to happen in our world. So this morning, I want to continue our series on David. David was a young man that we read about who was a shepherd, who eventually became a warrior, who eventually became king. And so we're going to talk about the life of David this fall, and probably the best way for me to talk about David is we're going to talk about David, warts and all. We always think about this gigantic guy who just was this man after God's own heart, which is a reality. However, there are parts of David's life that are not necessarily chasing after God's own heart. So we're going to dive into some of those here today, or actually during our series. But today I want to look at a friendship, an unlikely friendship that basically David had as a friend with the son of David's greatest enemy. It was King Saul. But as we talk about friendship here today, folks, I want to be real careful. I think it would be real easy to say, you need a friend, and this is why, and we dive into pop psychology, and I become Dr. Phil, and I start using phrases like, that dog just won't hunt, right? I don't want to go there. I want to say God created friendship. God created friendship as much as He created any other relationship, and therefore, when it is done right, it is God-honoring, and it is one that we should not live without. But yet statistic after statistic is saying that, especially in America, we are foregoing close friendships. So let's go ahead and dive in here today. And as we dive in, we're going to look at 1 Samuel, and we're going to be in chapter 18. This is somewhat of the beginning of the friendship. And it says this: as soon as he had finished speaking, he, meaning David, to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of a robe that was on him, and he gave it to David, and his armor, and even his own sword and bow, and his belt. So this is a little bit odd to us. Like, when I tell somebody I want to be their friend, it's kind of like, hey, you want to do lunch sometime? But this is not that type of friendship. In fact, kind of what happens here is this is really kind of foreign to us, but Jonathan takes off his outer robe. He didn't take off all his clothes, but he took off his outer robe, and then he gave his sword, his belt, and his armor to David. And that's a very special thing. In fact, in this day and age, there would have been nothing that would have been more precious to you and more personal than your armor. In fact, how many of y'all hunt in here? If you hunt, or how many have guns? We got guns? I got a few more people. How many of y'all have special relationships with your gun? Okay? You're like, that one there's Bubba, and that one's Boudreaux, right? And so you have a special relationship with your gun. It's as if he had that special relationship with his armor, and he gave it to David saying, I'm committed to you. It's a covenant. It's agreement to say, we're going to be friends. And so that's what happens. And as this story plays out, it's not just like there's one moment of friendship in David's life and then there is no more. It's as if there's a bigger story being told. And as this story is being told, there's moments, actually defining moments of friendship that play out in David's life. You see, Saul kind of had this love-hate relationship with David. Saul was the king, and David had defeated Goliath, and David's popularity grew, and as his popularity grew, Saul saw his popularity and role diminish in Israel. So to kind of let you know how bad it had gotten, David's playing the harp at supper one night, and he's like the modern day Chris Tomlin, and he's doing all this wonderful, beautiful music, and then all of a sudden, Saul grabs his spear and lunges it to David. Now, albeit he missed, but nothing says friendship like, I'm going to throw a spear at you right now. So David knew that things were not very good. And actually, at that point in time, Saul set out to kill David. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 19, we read about that. In verses 1 through 4, it says, And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. And I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, Let not the king's sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. Now, this puts Jonathan in a very precarious situation in which he has to honor the covenant that he has with David. He wants to honor David. He wants to speak well of him, but he also understands that his dad's the king. When your dad is the king, it doesn't matter if you're a son or not, you could die. But he fiercely defended David, and he was fiercely loyal to David. And I believe this is a defining moment of friendship. In fact, a defining moment of friendship is, I've got your back. Y'all know what I'm talking about? This to me is like a pinnacle in friendship. And nothing can scar a person worse than when you thought a friend had your back and that friend does not have your back. In fact, it can leave scars well into the future of your life where it causes you to not want to get close to other people. Let me tell you about my last ministry. In fact, talk about my last ministry. We've been here 16 years. So this was about 20 years ago. Went to a small church in Missouri, and I'm going to tell you, a few years into the ministry, there were a few guys, there's probably 6 guys, 7 guys maybe, that I thought were loyal friends. I thought they were the guys that no matter what would have my back. There were actually 2 that as soon as I met these guys, it's kind of like we've been friends forever. You ever have those friends? I mean, there was this one particular guy. I mean, we could talk politics, we could talk hunting, we could talk farming, anything that it's just like we had been friends forever, and I thought we would be friends forever. There's another guy that our families did stuff together. Kids were the same age. Their kids would come over to our house, vice versa. We spent a long time just talking to him. And again, I thought this man would be friends for life. And then I discovered that these 2 men who I thought I was closest to in the church were my staunchest critics when I wasn't around. I mean, it's almost 2 decades ago. Still stings. Still hurts. Still makes my blood boil when I think about it. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've been there. And when those moments happen in life, what do? We add a brick to our wall. Or maybe we add a lot of bricks to our wall to kind of just keep people at a distance. But I think we need to remember that there is a bigger story being told here. Or the story is David is hated by Saul. There's a hit out on his life. And because there's this hit out on his life, and Saul's not worried about other countries anymore. He's no longer worried about defending Israel anymore. He is just passionately pursuing David to kill him. And so, as you might guess, David, he doesn't go immediately from killing Goliath into kingship. There's a lot of years here. And a lot of those years, most of those years, he's on the run from Saul. He's hiding in caves. He's living in the desert. He actually has to go to foreign countries to hide out there. So the reality is this has got to mount some pressure in David's life. You ever had pressure in your life? Have you ever had pressure in your life that you just need to vent? I think one of the reasons why we hire counselors many times is that we do not have friends. And we need to vent, but rather than venting to friends, we pay a friend, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? Well, David is having this moment where he needs to vent. And in chapter 20, verse 1, this is David venting. I'm going to read this with a lot of passion because I think there's a lot of passion here. It says, "Then David fled to Naioth and Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, 'What have I done? What is my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?'" David is spent. He's at the end of his rope. In fact, you get to verse 41, and it's another interaction. And again, there's much passion here. And it says, as soon as the boy had gone, there was a boy that was chasing arrows. As soon as the boy had gone, David rose beside the stone heap and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times, and they kissed one another. This is not homosexual kissing. This is Middle Eastern. So don't try to play that game here, okay? And they kissed one another, and they wept one another, David weeping the most. Can I tell you what never happens here? What never happens is Jonathan says, you know what, David, buck up. You ever want to do that to people? I have zero compassion, so I am really, really good at that one. He doesn't tell him to buck up. He doesn't tell him to get over it. He lets him have his moment. He lets him just let it all hang out. And I think one of the pinnacles, one of the defining moments in friendship comes when you have the freedom to be yourself. David let everything go. David let everything out. I think too many times we suffer from the scenario called the last 10%. Y'all familiar with this? In men's ministry, they talk about this a great deal, and is that we're willing to be honest, and we're willing to be open, and we're willing to be vulnerable, and we're willing to let people know what our sin is and what our struggles are in life, except to that last 10%. We're not going to let that one go, because that one is a place of vulnerability. That one is a place of trust. That one is a place that you have to be incredibly, incredibly safe, because what if it gets out? What if I say, I'm struggling with pornography, I'm struggling in my marriage? What if we say those things and somebody goes, hey, by the way? I mean, it destroys a person. And so sometimes we would rather suffer in silence rather than go to that last 10%. Well, David and Jonathan had that last 10% friendship. David was willing to just let everything be known in his life when Jonathan was around. But I think we have to remember there's a bigger story being told. It's not just about being safe in friendships. That's not the point of this. There's a bigger story being told, and the story kind of comes to a culmination, kind of an end point before Jonathan's death in 1 Samuel 23. And in 1 Samuel 23, in verses 15 through 18, it says this: David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness at Ziph at Horish, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horish and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. And my father knows this. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horish, and Jonathan went home. This right here is a sermon in and of itself. I just want to kind of point out a couple of items here. If you're one of those people that underlines in your Bible, and that's okay, underline, and strengthened his hand in God. If you really want to know what encouragement is, it's strengthening someone. And here's a guy in Jonathan knowing that if his father hadn't messed up, he would have been king. But now God has chosen David as king, and instead of pouting about it, instead of sulking about it, instead of trying to join his father and killing David, he says this, and I shall be next to you. That's encouragement. In fact, ladies, I'm going to give you an insight into men this morning that you did not know. So listen up. If you really want to encourage a man, proximity matters more than words. I learned this a couple years ago. I'd heard this before, but I learned this a couple years ago. When I broke my leg, I was homebound for a couple weeks, and I had a lot of visitors. But I had 3 friends that came by for visits. One of them was John McCauley Jr., we'll call him. He came by, and John had had a similar accident. He had broken his legs, got pins, and got rods and different things like that. And I can't even really remember what John and I talked about, but he was there. Paul Keene, one of our guys on staff, he went on staff then, came by. He brought brisket. The way to my heart is smoked meat. But I remember as Paul prayed with me and for me, feeling encouragement. One of the other men that came by was Tom Shaffer. Tom's one of our elders here at the church, and I've known Tom for over 16 years. And we've been through quite a lot as friends. But I remember Tom coming over, and the day that Tom came over, I was not feeling well. And Tom was willing to just sit in my living room and be quiet. And let me be quiet. But a friend was by my side. We can never underestimate the power of a true friend that strengthens your hand in God. And this true friend that David had in Jonathan was just willing to be by his side. And that's no small thing. And as we consider, though, the friendship between David and Jonathan, and let's just be real honest, it was more on the part of Jonathan than it was on the part of David. There's a bigger story being told. In the story that's being told at this moment in time is God is building a king. I mean, we realize that David was a shepherd, and God was building a king. And God made this shepherd boy a warrior, and God was building a king. And during this time of warrior, during this time that David was a man of war and a man of battle, he went through the darkest moments of his life. He went through trial after trial after trial. And the reality is that in order for God to build that king, now David would not be a perfect man, he would be a flawed man, but he would be the king that everyone would look to and say there was no other king like David. But in order to get that king, God had to hone him, had to mold him, had to shape him, which also meant he had to break him, which also meant that he had to crush him, that he had to take him through many a trial that David did not want to go through. And here's something I want you to understand. God didn't give David a pass from his trials, but he did give him a friend. And we would rather God probably not take us through trials, right? But God had a work that he needed to do in David's life, and the reality is he knew that it would be difficult. So rather than spare him from that, he gave him a friend who would walk beside him, be with him, and encourage him through those difficult moments of his life. That's the bigger story. God was building a king. And that brings us to our bottom line here today. And folks, I want you to get this. God will not spare you from your trials. But he does give you community. He will give you his church. And from our church community should come friends. From our church community should come those friends that love at all times, that walk beside you and you walk beside them in the most difficult times of life. from that church community should become those people who will defend you to the nth degree. And even when you're wrong, and even when you sin, they are still by your side. Because here's what I'll tell you. God has a plan to develop you. God has a plan to shape you. And Kyle spoke about this a few weeks ago from James chapter 1, is that the pathway to maturity and completion is always going to be through trials. That's the way God works. So He's not going to spare you. There's going to be illness. There's going to be death. There's going to be job strain. There's going to be job loss. There's going to be financial difficulty. There's going to be relationship difficulty. These things are going to be there in our lives. But what He has promised is give you a community as you walk through those. But here's a problem. Very few of us have that. Very few of us even know what that looks like, especially that last 10%. Most of us have convinced ourselves that we don't need it. And I'll be real honest with you. The words coming through my mind as I've written this sermon and I have preached this sermon this week is, Shaffer, you're such a hypocrite. I don't have that. I've got a lot of good friends. I had a friend call me this week and said, breakfast. That's it. We had breakfast this week. I can't tell you that we're there yet, but we're getting there. But the reality is most of us do not have that friendship. And guys, men, I want to talk specifically to you because I'm a guy. We've bought into the lie. We've bought into the lie that we don't need one another. We've bought into the lie that we can do this Christian walk thing, that we can do our marriages, that we can be dads, that we can be husbands by ourselves. In fact, masculinity in America, if you want to just define it, what is it? Rugged individualism, right? But David was a guy's guy. He was a warrior. He was a man of battle. But he also understood the importance of a friend. So I want to offer some next steps here today. First one's going to sound a little redundant. Take the next step. So when I say take the next step, here's what I mean by that. I get to sit up here week in and week out. You know what? I know who's here and who's not here because I can look to certain sections in the church and know who is here and who's not here. You sit at the same place every week. Some of y'all probably walk in, somebody's in your seat, and you can start going, what am I going to do, right? So here's what I want you to do today. You probably know some faces around you, but you don't always know names around you. Let's take the next step and just introduce yourself. Don't wait for somebody to introduce themselves to you. Just take that next step. Maybe in the gathering area, there's somebody you talk to every week. Maybe it's say, hey, give me your phone number. I want to text you sometime, and we're going to do lunch. So take that next step into friendship. Also, be intentional. Chip Ingram is a church leader, and one of the things that Chip has said is that you do not drift into community. You don't drift into friendships. You don't drift into small groups. You don't drift into church. What you do is you drift out. That's the natural progression of things. So you're going to have to be intentional. So here's how I want to close up our message here today. I want you to think of that friend. I want you to think about that friend that's in Texas or Colorado or California or wherever it is. I want you to think of that friend that's maybe in your neighborhood that you know is a Christian, maybe a guy here in the church that you've become friends with, maybe a Christian friend at work. But I want you to think about that friend, and here's what I'd like to do. I'd like for us, as Will is playing on the keyboard, to just bow our heads for a moment and pray specifically for that friend. Now, as we've done that this morning, I'm going to venture to say that there are many of you who have come to the realization of how much you hate silence. So that friend is on your mind right now. Now, I'm going to tell you that most of the time when we listen to sermons, I do this all the time, so I'm not ridiculing anybody else other than myself. Listen to a sermon and I'll go, you know what? I need to do that. And this week, I'm going to make the decision. And this week, I'm going to do this. But guess what happens when this week happens? This week happens. So here's what I'd like for you to do right now. Take your phones. And Jim's going to get up here to talk in a few moments. And I want you to take your phones. And I want you to text that friend that you were praying for. And just say, lunch, ? Breakfast, ? This week. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your servant David, and I thank you for your servant Jonathan, who was a friend among friends. And Lord, may we not just sit back and wait for that. Thank you. In Jesus' name.